Hey everybody, welcome to the C Butters channel where we are constantly comparing two devices that we can't make up our mind about. This time we're talking about handhelds, and we've got the ROG Ally here and the SteamDeck. Now I picked up the SteamDeck basically at launch day and have had it for a while. I played around with it quite a bit when I first got it, but then it's kind of been sitting on a shelf as I have a lot of other devices that I've been playing with. But when the Ally came out, I did a video on using it in VR. It's a very powerful device, and that video even got picked up by iFixit, which was really cool to see. They used it to show how powerful it was because I was playing VR on it, Half-Life Alyx. So check out that video if you haven't seen it. But stepping into the Ally, I was like, wow, I now have all the power I need to do, more complicated games. The screen is really nice. But like many of you may have noticed, if you've poked around the Ally community, there's issues with the SD card, and I did run into those issues. And unfortunately, I ran into those issues. I had a 1 terabyte card in here that died on me. And it didn't die because it was a bad SD card. It actually worked in other devices. It just did not work in this device. So I was actually in the middle of a trip, and suddenly all my emulation, all my games would no longer work. And I was left in a lurch. So that really put a bad taste in my mouth for the Ally, because I upgraded this to a 2 terabytes, and then I had 1 terabyte on the micro SD because I just want to load it up with all my games, all my retro stuff, get it filled up, and so just have everything on hand. I always like kind of maxing my devices, building the ultimate device. And then it failed on me, and I was like, man, that kind of sucks. And then even looking into like doing a return, I was out of my return window, and then it was like, am I gonna send this back to, I gotta take this to Best Buy and send it back to Asus. It's gonna, the turnaround time, I was just like, man, that just sucks. And even if you get a new return unit, the SD card may not work on the return unit. They haven't said they have a fix for this. So even if I got a different unit, my SD card's probably just going to go bad on that one. Is what it looks like right now. Hopefully Asus shows us that there is a solution for it, but I have not seen it yet. So for me, that put the ROG Ally in a little bit of bad taste in my mouth, and I started playing around with my SteamDeck again. Because when I first got this, you couldn't put Windows on it. So I now have a dual boot Windows SteamOS setup on this machine, and it's been a lot of fun to play with as well. But don't count the ROG Ally out just yet for me, because I'm going to go through all these different mods that I've done. But before I get to that, I've done mods on both the ROG Ally and the SteamDeck, so stay tuned in this video as I'll get to it eventually. But the first thing I want to do is talk about the pros and cons of each device. Now, let's talk about the pros of the SteamDeck. So the SteamDeck is great. One of the things I like about it are the controllers feel really premium. And I mean, even the plastics, it just feels more smoother. It feels nice. It feels more durable. In fact, in doing some mods, I've scratched up the plastic on this device internally, and the plastic, I feel like I could just rip it with my fingernails, frankly. It's very, I don't know what's going on with the plastic, but it felt pretty malleable, which is fine. But the SteamDeck definitely feels more premium. The software feels more integrated because it runs SteamOS. All the games that you run on this thing are very easy to use. It's easy to open up the performance overlays. You just hit your 3 circle button, and then you've got performance overlays that you can turn on, and it works great. When you try to do that kind of thing on the Ally, sometimes Windows gets in your way, and depending on if your game is operating in exclusive full screen or borderless full screen, borderless window full screen, it may not show the stats you want, or you try to turn on the stats, then you go back to the game and you have a black screen. It just does some weird things, and I found that SteamOS tends to just work in a lot more scenarios where the ROG Ally can be a little bit janky. So The other great things about this device are you have the touch pads. Now this is not a huge thing, but if you start using Windows or the Linux desktop inside SteamOS, like that becomes really useful. So I do like that aspect of it. The ROG Ally doesn't have that. It's not a fatal difference, I would say. The other thing that is good about this device for some things is the 16:10 display aspect ratio. It makes the screen feel bigger than the ROG Ally, but I'll have things to say about that when I talk about the Ally Pros, because while the screen does have an aspect ratio that I like, most games tend to be 16:9. So there's some differences there, and I'll just say it now, but while the ROG Ally screen can look a little bit smaller when they're turned on because it's not as tall, the 16:9 aspect ratio on the SteamDeck with black bars on top and bottom is actually smaller than it is on the Ally. 16:9 games, Switch emulation, all is bigger. The screen is bigger in those scenarios, so that is a plus for the Ally. But the screen aspect ratio is a nice thing on the deck. The other thing that's really nice about this thing is it's been on the market for a while. It has a big community around the Steam Deck, and as you can see, I've done quite a few mods, which I'll explain all the mods that I've done to this machine in a second here. But it's very hackable. There's so many things you can do with it. People have kind of figured out the device, and it's fun. It's fun. There's a lot of third-party things you can do to it. I installed some Hall Effect joysticks on this, which use magnets and should be a lot more durable. So it's a really great device, even now, even compared to the ROG Ally. And enough that I don't want to get rid of this device, even though I have the Ally. So that's an issue, which I'll get into. Let's talk about the pros of the ROG Ally. So the best thing about this is performance. Well, I don't know if that's the best thing, but that's definitely one of the things it has going for it. It has double the cores. It has more compute units. However, it's not as big of a difference as you would expect, but you can definitely expect in your games you're going to get 20 to 25% more performance. And in some scenarios, maybe a lot more, but from what I've seen in terms of emulation, first of all, if you're emulating NES, that extra performance gets you nothing. So if you're looking primary at emulation, the only place this is going to help you out is in Wii U or Switch emulation, where it does a little bit better, but not as much as you would be led to believe. As I said, there's a lot of mods you can do to the Steam Deck to improve performance. But yeah, it's still way more performant. I'm not going to slight it in its performance because it does give you quite a bit better. The other great thing about it is the screen. Now, the screen, I would prefer that it were 16:10, and you can see they kind of trick you. It looks like it's a tall screen, but then once the device is actually on, it's actually not as tall as it looks. It's kind of like a widescreen format in there, and there's black bars on the top and the bottom, and so the screen is not as big. However, the screen is way more vibrant. You get 120 hertz. It's also a variable refresh rate on the screen, which makes games look really good. Things just pop on this display. It's really nice for a handheld, and especially compared to the Steam Deck, which can feel quite muddy. The other thing that's really neat about this, and I'm tipping my hand a little bit on the mod, you can fit a 2280 SSD in here. I don't recommend it, and I'm someone who recommends lots of mods. I have put a 2280 SSD in mine. It's a 4 terabyte, but I had to do way more to the case in terms of drilling out some of the plastic and adjusting the Wi-Fi antennas than I would recommend a casual user to do. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not too bad, but you're going to avoid your warranty, absolutely. Some of the cooling mods I do on other things you could easily remove and send it back in for warranty. If you put a 2280 SSD in this thing, you are not ever sending this thing back in for warranty. But it is nice, and having 4 terabytes on this, so basically, as I said, my micro SD card died, and I was not happy about that because I wanted more than 2 terabytes to fit everything I wanted to fit on this machine. So I was relying on an extra 1 terabyte to get 3 from the micro SD card. So that was bad, but the fact that I can put a 2280 in here up to 8 terabytes is kind of makes up for an SD card that doesn't work for me personally. So that's what I did. I upgraded this to 4 terabytes, and I'm pretty happy with that, which has put it back in the running as being my primary handheld gaming device. So anyways, another thing that's worth noting on the ROG Ally is you actually get a Windows license. You can put Windows on the Steam Deck. However, that Windows will need to be activated with the license that you're going to have to buy if you want it to be activated. So that's a plus for the ROG Ally. The other thing that it can do, especially if you're in the EmuDeck environment, is EmuDeck on Steam. For the most part, it tends to open up, if you open everything up through Emulation Station and you're trying to use per application, so like you're using different executables for your, for whether you're doing Wii emulation or Switch emulation or SNES emulation, you want to be able to set custom thermal parameters, like only use 5 watts when you're using this one, do 15 watts when you're using this one, use 8 watts when you're using this one. The per application, it all looks the same. It all comes up on this like Steam application that's like a wrapper for everything underneath it. So while you can quickly control your thermal wattage and stuff, it doesn't stick if you're changing between different emulators and applications. Even though it's a per application setting, because it's in that Steam wrapper, you have to adjust it constantly. Where on this one, if it opens up a certain emulator versus another one, even launching from the same emulation station, the Windows environment does let you set a per application that is a lot more useful. So that's another thing that I like about the ROG Ally running its items under Windows. And to be fair, you could do the same thing on the Steam Deck if you put your Steam environment on a Windows partition rather than the SteamOS. But then you're losing a lot of the SteamOS features. So it's complicated, right? Okay, so the other thing that I really like about the ROG Ally, to an extent, is the form factor. So, which, as you'll see here, they're similar. However, they're actually more similar than you would think. One of the big things is if you look at the protrusions on the bottom, if they're at the same level, the joystick on the Steam Deck is much higher. So it's about a ½ inch difference in thickness going from bottom of your pad to top of joystick. However, it's not that bad. What is bad is the Steam Deck stock case is huge, and that does not fit in my backpack at all. However, you can get different cases that fit the Steam Deck, and then it does fit in my bag pretty easily. The stock ROG Ally bag that a lot of people like to hate on because it's not worth what they sell it for, but it is great. It's very thin. It slips into pretty much anything where the Steam Deck stock case did not. However, in practice, this is a lot easier to cart around just due to that. But this is more comfortable. But it is bigger, bulkier, wider by a little bit, but not as much as you'd think. It is heavier though, just slightly. It's pretty close, pretty close. Anyways, let's get into the cons. So what are the cons of the Steam Deck? Well, the biggest con in my estimation, and the only thing that keeps me from using this device as my primary, or that would, that's really holding me back from just saying, hey, whatever with the Ally. Let's just keep using the Steam Deck. That would be, it's not the performance. You would think it'd be the performance, but it's not. It's the screen. The screen on this thing, while the resolution is 1280 by 800, it's not even the resolution either. It is the quality of the display, and it does not look great. I have installed the mod Vibrant Deck in order to kind of make the colors pop more, but the motion clarity on this thing it's just not nearly as good as ROG Ally. The ROG Ally has a really great screen, so that is definitely a con on the Steam Deck. Another con is the performance maxes at 15 watts. And when I say maxes, I mean the silicon itself pretty much maxes at 15 watts. It can go 20. Stock, you really can't go much over 15 watts without it suddenly like clamping down because it's overheating. But if you do mods, you know, improve the cooling, you can get it up to 20 watts pretty easily, but you just don't gain much performance. The ROG Ally with its twin fan, twin cooling solution can push up to 30 watts pretty easily and doesn't even get as hot as the Steam Deck does. So this can use 30 watts as well because it has double the cores. It has more execution units. This thing, you're tapped out at your 15 watts. That said, this is it keeps going back and forth on efficiency because I think a lot of the things to do with efficiency are the drivers and the way that it's just configured in terms of voltages and SoC. So 15 watts on this thing is pretty close to 15 watts on this thing, but you can bump the performance up on this machine up to 30 watts, which really lets the silicon fly. But at the same time, if you are just wanting to play these on the go, you probably don't want to be using more than 15 watts. In that case, the Steam Deck would be completely adequate if you're only operating at 15 watts. But the problem with it is even if this thing is plodding around at 40 frames a second, and this one's plodding around at 40 to 45 frames a second in a game, for example, just because you've tuned the wattages to that, because of the variable refresh rate and the really great response time on this machine's display, it looks so much better on this one. So that's definitely a Steam Deck con. You know, we're talking about performance on the screen. So yeah, the other thing that I mentioned that's a con, the stock case is huge. I find it unusable to actually carry around because it's just so big, and it's just like, it literally doesn't fit in my backpack. So let's talk about the cons on the ROG Ally. So the major con that we have right now is the SD card is basically unusable. And there's plenty of people who will say, my SD card is working fine. Okay, that's fine, and I'm happy, and I hope it keeps working for you. That said, there is a high enough percentage of people with non-working SD cards and mine isn't working, and I'm out of my return period, so to swap it out is going to involve an RMA of a couple weeks, and I just didn't want to mess around with it. Anyways, so that the SD card issues are a major con. Think what you will, but for me, mine doesn't work, so it's a problem. Joysticks are subpar, and I'm not going to sugarcoat that. They're okay, but they're gummy, and especially the buttons as well. They're pretty gummy too. You hear that? Like as I'm pushing on it, it's not very tactile. It's kind of squishy. Steam Deck, you can really bounce it on there. It just feels a lot better. And like if say I could push this maybe like, I don't know, say I could push this 50 times a second. This one I can push 60 times a second. It's more responsive. So that is definitely a con of the ROG Ally. And the dead zones, like, if you've heard that and you don't understand what people mean by the dead zones. So like if I'm running an emulator and I try to like just barely make a character walk, like say you're playing, you know, whatever. You're trying to make your character walk, you kind of just barely push it, he's not moving at all. And you have to push it a little further, and you don't really know where the circle is, where it's, so you can't do precise movements super easily on the ROG Ally because those dead zone issues. It's not a huge issue. In fact, I didn't even notice them until I really, you know, had played a couple hours and going back and forth between the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally. I was like, oh, that's what they're talking about. So it's not a showstopper, but it is definitely not as good as the deck. The deck does a really good job at being a controller. The other thing about the ROG Ally is SteamDeck, the software that lots of people use on these things. It does exist for the ROG Ally, but it's still in kind of a beta phase, and there are little issues with it. There's still many issues trying to get the motion controls to work on the ROG Ally. You can get them working, but you kind of have to do this mishmash of handheld companion and SteamDeck, and then there's all of the Asus branded stuff on here, and it's all trying to fight each other. Like, it's crazy the state of controllers. You have to get emulated controllers. It is so confusing, and half the time things don't work when you're trying to get this working perfectly in several different emulators at once. It can be a chore. Where on the SteamDeck, you just kind of run through the setup, install a few things, and it's good to go. So that is definitely an ROG Ally Con. And like I said, the controls, I just don't like them as much as the Steam Deck, particularly this directional pad. I don't like circle directional pads. I know that it's fine, like it works and I can play okay, but I much prefer the Steam Deck's directional pad that's not circular. I grew up, my first game system was a Nintendo Entertainment System, aging myself here, but I prefer it. And so for that, the controls on the ROG Ally are not as good. And the other thing is I'm able to replace the joysticks on the Steam Deck. I've already done it. There's no aftermarket for these yet. Now that could be coming, but it's not here yet, so that's definitely a consideration. The other thing is, in most software that I've used, this right back button and left back button are treated this as the same button. It's really weird. Not for everything, but it's just, there's a few janky things going on with it, where the Steam Deck, you literally have 4 different buttons that are all configurable inside Steam, and they work great. And they're less protrusive too, so the controller feel is definitely a major plus for the Steam Deck. So I think I went over, I basically, because my SD card wasn't working, I decided to mod a 2280 SSD into my ROG Ally so I could get the space that I wanted. That allowed me to put a 4 terabyte SSD in this thing, which is in here now. And it was working great. So that is actually a really cool thing about the ROG Ally, because there's no way in the Steam Deck, well, there are ways if you want to cut into your chassis to get a 2280 SSD in there, but they're not nearly as clean as this. This looks stock, but I literally have a 4 terabyte drive in here, and I could have put an 8 terabyte drive if I wanted to drop like $1,000 on 8 terabytes, but I don't need that much. 4 is great. So yeah, it makes it really hard to decide between these two, because you get better performance, an amazing screen, although the screen's not 1610, it's only 16:9. But then the controllers aren't as good, but I don't know, it's really hard to make a decision between these two things. So, but what I have had a good time with is installing all sorts of mods and software configurations on the Steam Deck. I have overclocked the RAM from 5500 megahertz to 6400 megahertz, which is actually good for about 5 to 8 performance uplift in a lot of games. The CPU, I've not only undervolted, I guess the APU, I should say, I was able to do an undervolt of -25. SoC I left at 0 because I'm overclocking the RAM, and -25 on the GPU. If that doesn't mean anything to you, look at Cryobyte 33's overclocking, undervolting guide. He's got the best one out there that's not perfect, but he does have a guide on how to do it. I was able to bump the refresh rate on this thing to 70 Hertz, which can help mostly in PC games. And still, the screen can be iffy. I was able to install Vibrant Deck, which increases the color saturation on things. You can play with your gamma, which is nice to be able to play with. It still does not fix the screen's issues, though. Power tools. In addition to my undervolt, I've overclocked the CPU from 3.5 to 3.8 gigahertz. I have unlocked this so I can use 18 watts if I want, but like I say, there's no point in going past 15 watts. You're getting like a percentage point of improvement for a lot more heat and temperature and fan noise. So I think 15 watts is definitely the sweet spot on the Steam Deck. I don't see a point of going higher. I do see a point of undervolting it so it can do more with the 15 watts and giving it a little more clock speed so it can do more with the 15 watts. But yeah, there's just really no point in trying to push this further because you're basically adding a bunch of heat for little gains that you wouldn't really notice. I applied PTM 7950 thermal interface material. I removed the back and plugged in. It's actually a phase change material, so that is something I definitely recommend, replacing the thermal interface material. PTM 7950 seems to do the trick. I also obviously have put this JSaux back plate on this. They do have alternative buttons here, but I like the stock buttons just fine. So that's what I left, and I think it looks great. The black is fine too, but I think having done so many mods underneath the hood here, it's fun to see them. The fan, like I said, this was an original launch day Steam Deck when I ordered it, and it had the Delta fan, which was super noisy. And I also have put a 2 terabyte SSD in the Steam Deck with a 1 terabyte micro SD, so this is a 3 terabyte Steam Deck. I also replaced the sticks with Hall Effect sensor sticks. I also, like this JSaux cover comes with a metal pad, and it does extract heat from the inside, and this actually gets really hot when it's running, which is fine because your fingers aren't on it, but you could notice it, but that's heat that you're keeping things cool. And the real benefit, when people do all these cooling mods, the real benefit isn't like, oh, I can cool it more so I can push it harder. I mean, that's kind of it, but for me, the cooler you can keep it by being efficient with your cooling is the lower the fan speed has to actually run. So when I had the Delta fan, this thing was noisy. Like, this was a very noisy device. And that's an obvious pro of the ROG Allys. It's very quiet. It's a really nice cooling setup on the ROG Ally. But this was loud. But having replaced the Delta fan in this with the newer version fan or alternative version fan, it really reduced the fan noise. And with the cooling mods, at the same temperature, it can push the fan slower. So at this point, this at 15 watts is a great device. It's very quiet. It's as quiet as the ROG Ally with the mods that I've done to it. But that said, I had to, do mods to this. The ROG Ally just is that quiet out of the box. So these are all the things that are a consideration right now when you're looking at the ROG Ally and the Steam Deck. So for me, I'm still undecided on which one I want to keep. And like I say, I'm probably just going to keep both of them right now because I do really like the screen and the added performance on this device. I also really like the fact that I could use that XG mobile port and run a 4090 on this thing, which the CPU is more than powerful enough to run decent frame rates, even with pushing a 4090, which the Steam Deck is just not going to be able to do. So I have been using the ROG Ally more now that I was so mad about that micro SD card not working. I was ready to go back to the Steam Deck, but I'm still hanging on because I was able to mod a 2280 SSD into this device, which has given it the little bit of pros above the Steam Deck that make me kind of want to keep the Ally more than the Steam Deck. So anyways, these are my thoughts on the ROG Ally and the Steam Deck. If you enjoyed this video, do a subscribe or like, and more content coming soon. Thanks for watching.